That's right. Right. So let's try that again with the camera rolling. And try to keep this as simple as possible, since all four of you here just heard this spiel. Well, I've forgotten to turn the camera on. Today we're looking at India and South Africa, independence movements, nationalist movements. Led by, in the case of India, seeking its independence from Britain, Mohandas Gandhi, a pioneer of civil disobedience, a form of nonviolent protest that would inspire the American civil rights movement, and also inspire Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, which lead a movement to free black South Africans within the newly independent South African nation from a rigid and oppressive form of segregation known as apartheid. And Mandela's movement would not remain nonviolent. And so we see here a philosophically nonviolent movement, and a movement that initially is nonviolent that is forced into responding to violence with violence. I want to begin, though, in India, and that was a mistake, but I'm going to roll with it, just so we know. And I know we've talked about India in here before. When last we did, we were talking about imperialism, and the Indian subcontinent comes under the direct rule of Britain, which had established ties with India going back to the time that the Portuguese had made that connection in the 17th and 18th century. And the British win that power struggle and establish trading forts on the coast of India, connections through the British East India Company, which, with the backing of military force in the 19th century, exploits the weakness of the Mughal Empire in India to actually establish British colonial rule. So by the time we get to the 19th century, we're talking about the time of the British Raj, where you have a governor essentially appointed by the Queen, accountable to Parliament. You have a civil service comprised of all British people ruling the country. And technically the Queen is the Empress of India, and so on. And so the net effect is that Indians are second-class citizens at best in their own home nation. Ruled in toto by outsiders. Yes, in the interior there were the so-called princely states, where basically some of these wealthy Indian princes are able to pay their way into sort of home rule. The British are not so much concerned with the interior of India as they are with the coast. You know that the British had brought a certain measure of industrialization to the Indian subcontinent, building railroad lines and telegraph lines and such, but as always with imperialism, you have to ask yourself to what end. It was to the furtherance of the British industrial empire, not to any direct benefit necessarily for the Indian people. You know, the British are especially concerned with getting raw materials from India like cotton, which they bring back to Britain and use in the textile industry, and then they ship the finished textile products back to India. So, as we discussed before, they had destroyed the cottage industry system in India, and now are not only extracting resources from India, but then holding India as a captive market for their finished product manufactured goods. By the late 1800s, the late 19th century, you had a group of Indian folks who wanted to organize, not necessarily yet for independence, which was maybe hard to imagine at that point, in the high tide of British imperialism in the 1880s, but simply to argue that they ought to have more say-so in government. That they ought to be able to influence the British administration of their country to, for example, spend more on economic development that would actually benefit Indians, as opposed to spending, some massive percentage on the military, for example. And these are wealthy, what we would call high caste Indians. These are not your average, everyday Indian citizens, or subjects, as it were. And so they don't represent the mass of Indian people, and that's actually part of their argument. It's, hey, we're the upper class, we're educated. Hell, some of us are educated in British universities and have come back home. You know, we are the elites. Shouldn't you at least allow us some kind of say-so in governance? And so they form an Indian National Congress to that end. And they claim to be speaking for all Indians, but again, these are our upper caste Indians. What do I mean by caste? This is one of the unique things about India, the caste system. It's like a class system, kind of, in that you have upper caste, upper class, lower class, middle class. But it's much more complex than that, and it's much more rigid, inflexible. So going back to nearly ancient Indian civilization, there have been, at least since the migration of the so-called Aryan peoples into the Indian subcontinent, there had been 4 major castes. The most uppermost castes were composed early on of priests, and later that would encompass like scholars and teachers and things like that, but Hindu priests for sure. And in the ancient times, the next caste down, the second one from the top, was comprised of warriors, but that would later be, obviously warriors would be less relevant in the 19th century, especially in the British Raj, so that would include, people who were in positions of local governance or positions of some wealth or means of power. And then below that were more or less everyday people, farmers, merchants, this kind of thing, craftsmen, who were of Aryan descent, lighter-skinned people of the supposedly superior Aryan peoples, not indigenous Indian peoples, who would comprise that 4th caste. And then there was a caste, not even a caste, there were people who were outside the caste system, who were below even that 4th caste, who were known as the Dalit, or the untouchables. The poorest of the poor, the people who did the shittiest of shitty jobs that no one else would do. The people that you wouldn't even go around, you wouldn't even want to be around, you wouldn't even be in their presence. They were thought of as almost subhuman. And it's even far more complex than that. There were those 4 major castes plus the untouchables, and there are actually literally hundreds of subcastes. And another difference between our class system and a caste system is that you're born into your caste. It generally represents an occupation, and there's very little chance of you rising above that class, or caste rather, or falling below it. And I mentioned that it is very rigid. Whereas in the West, theoretically at least, if you're working class, you could either work hard or get lucky and move up and become middle class, or a middle class could become an upper class, or vice versa, or whatever. Generally not so in India's caste system. You are what you are, as you are born. That makes sense? And again, this Indian National Congress is formed by people who are generally upper caste folks, claiming to speak for all, but not really. Britain actually used the caste system too to segregate or discriminate based on, who they would hire in lower level administrative positions.
How did they keep up with it if there's so many sub-level?
That's a good question. It's not like there's, an idiot's guide to the Indian caste system or any sort of thing like that. I guess it's so ingrained societally, you know what I mean? From birth, and so innately understood by everyone. And the relevance of it here is that you have a group that purporting to speak on behalf of everyone, but they don't share the same concerns as lower caste Indians, you know what I mean? And in fact, they're holding their own position as upper caste as an argument as to why they, and not literally everybody else, ought to have some say. Oh, we're better than these people, ought you to let us have some say, right? One other thing about these founders of the INC, they are by and large Hindu. I mean, initially they were exclusively Hindus. And you'll remember that a large number of Indian people, and even the last ruling people of the Indian subcontinent, were Muslim. And so it's to the Muslim nationalists to form their own nationalist Muslim League to represent their interests. So you got the INC, you got the Muslim League, and then a group of more radical thinking Hindu Indians who figure they ought to seek full independence, and even through terrorism or violence, forming another group known as the New League. So by the early 20th century, you've got three separate Indian nationalist movements. The mainstream but upper caste Hindu INC, the much more radical New League, and then the Muslim League. And what you needed was a singular figure to come and somehow figure out how to unite these different groups in one movement for Indian independence. And you know who that individual is going to be. And there he is. Mohandas Gandhi, pictured here and here. You probably recognize this Gandhi of later life, and perhaps not this one. But he was an English-trained lawyer. He goes to Britain and studies law. And in fact, in a sort of artificial connection to the second half of this lecture, when he leaves Britain, he goes to South Africa. In 1893, where he worked to organize and protect Indian laborers. There are a lot of migrant Indian workers in South Africa, in particular working in the diamond and gold mines. And I don't have to tell you what the conditions were like in those mines at that time. And when we talk about South Africa here in just a few minutes, you'll perhaps understand that the Indian workers there were treated as subhuman by the South African, initially British government. And Gandhi goes there to protect their rights, seeing as they were mistreated and discriminated against. And he spends quite a while there. He doesn't return to India until 1915. He joins the INC, which by that time had moved towards the radical end and was embracing the concept of full independence. So they drifted towards the New League, albeit not advocating violence, but definitely calling for full independence. Gandhi then sets about to steer the INC towards his concept of satyagraha, or non-violent resistance, passive resistance even. Satyagraha. These are at the core of a philosophy of life for Gandhi. Not just a strategy for a movement, but a way to live your life with a commitment, a philosophical commitment to nonviolence and passive resistance. And what would be an example of nonviolent or passive resistance? Civil disobedience is a particular kind of nonviolent resistance, passive resistance. Civil disobedience would mean to purposely break a law that you feel is unjust or immoral, or that is, violative of your natural rights, to put it in the sort of Western liberal language. To purposely break that law in order to raise awareness of the injustice of it. To raise an awareness of the fact that it is immoral or wrong. Civil as in law, disobedience is in purposely breaking that law to showcase what is wrong. If this sounds familiar, of course, this is what I mean when I say this influences the American Civil Rights Movement and leaders in the 50s and 60s. Most obviously Martin Luther King, but Jim Farmer and so many others. And John Lewis even. Gandhi's goals then, in addition to promoting this as a philosophy and a strategy for INC, become, number one, obviously to convince the British government that full independence for the Indian people is imperative. But number two, to unify the Indian people across caste lines, reach down to the lower castes, but also across religious lines as well. Because remember, you've got Hindus, you've got Muslims, you've got Sikhs. Gandhi wants to try to unify these movements. And then finally, three, when I say reach down, I mean even below the floor of the caste system, and to try to improve the lot and life of the untouchables. He's the first to suggest that a unification movement could even include the Dalit or the untouchables. By the 1920s, he has orchestrated a movement within Satyagraha and using INC known as Swadeshi. A nonviolent form of passive resistance, a boycott. Very American, isn't it? A boycott of British textiles specifically. A movement that says we're going to refuse to buy these British textiles that are made with Indian cotton, in a full awareness that the British imperialists had destroyed Indian cottage industry and were taking this raw material for the benefit of British industrialists and then selling that finished product at a marked up price back to the Indian people. So Gandhi says we're not going to buy it. We're going to boycott it. That's a form of passive resistance. And instead, says Gandhi, we'll make our own homespun cloth, as they used to do in the days before this British invasion, if you will. Homespun cloth known as khadi. And Gandhi himself would make this homespun khadi, as you see here, and would then dress from thereafter in the dhoti, the wrap, that white, simple cotton wrap made of khadi, as a visual showcase of this form of passive resistance that is Swadeshi. This cut to the core of the purpose of the colony, and if you study American history, it's the same thing that you saw in the late 18th century with American colonists boycotting certain British, both manufactured goods and raw materials, as a protest of their lack of representation in the British Parliament. This is similar here. And so it's a threat, of course, a significant threat to Britain. Anytime you're threatening the bottom line of your merchants, and to say nothing of tax revenue. So Gandhi's going to come on the radar pretty quickly of the leadership of the British government, both in India and at home in London. Back up just a little bit, though, to the period right after World War I, right after the Great War. Period in which, very briefly, people around the world in countries that had been colonized in the period of imperialism, people were encouraged by the words of Woodrow Wilson in his 14 points where he speaks about self-determination. That people ought to be able to have home rule, determine for themselves what their government will be, and not be ruled over by other nations. As you know, though, the reality is that you do see some form of self-determination in Europe with the breaking up of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire, and to a lesser extent with the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. But there is no end to imperialism. And so people's hopes are dashed. But it does lead to protests in India. People are inspired by the words of Wilson and others, and are induced to following Gandhi, who in 1919 is arrested as a threat to British rule, and his arrest sparks a general strike, specifically in Amritsar in the Punjab region of northwest India. Thousands of workers go on strike to protest the arrest of Gandhi and attempt to engage in a form of nonviolent protest, a march. They just try to march. But they were stopped and fired upon by British troops, with approximately 20 people being killed. This is just the beginning. Unarmed, nonviolent marchers murdered, 20 of them or so, by British troops. And this only serves to grow the protest. What had been a couple of thousand workers striking and marching becomes 10,000 before too long. Protests get a little bit unruly and threatening to troops in the area. And at a mass meeting at one point, British troops simply opened fire into an enclosed square, pictured at top right, killing nearly 400 people, many of whom were shot in the back. Trying to flee, but with nowhere to go, because I have mentioned it's an enclosed space. They're, of course, unarmed, so this is a massacre. The Amritsar massacre. Gandhi is blamed for his role in sparking the protest and made to feel like the bloodshed is his fault, while he languishes in prison, by the way. But eventually he would be released, and the British do, at least, Parliament accedes to the passage of the Government of India Act, giving Indians representation in an Indian parliament, which would have control over certain aspects of home rule like education, health, and agriculture. The British Parliament and Crown would retain control of the military, of foreign affairs, and most importantly, taxes. And in 1921, the British government, in fact, enacts an increased salt tax and bans the local manufacturing or harvesting of salt. What does it mean to manufacture salt or to harvest salt? What on earth would seem to be the most obvious and plentiful source of salt? The ocean, right? So if you live on the coast, at high tide, you could dig these pools, which when the water receded, you have these little pools of salt water that you could then evaporate, and then what would be left is the salt, right? Evaporate the water, the salt is left. This would be harvesting salt, a process that would be known to coastal peoples for generations. And now you have the British government telling you can't do that. I mean, it's your own coastline, your own land, your own customs, your own tradition. And not only are they telling you can't do that, but the whole point of them telling you can't do that is so that you have to buy salt from the British government or British merchants, and that carries a tax on it, which is more burdensome still. And so Gandhi, as a form of satyagraha, says, well, we'll not only boycott British salt, but we will deliberately violate this law that says we're not supposed to do this, and I'll throw in a march too in order to raise awareness. In fact, I will literally march on foot hundreds of miles to the coast where we will symbolically and deliberately defy the British government in harvesting salt. Salt march. 240-mile protest march all the way to the sea to symbolically harvest salt. Of course, Gandhi is again arrested and thrown in prison, but his profile has risen at this point. There is now international awareness of this Indian independence movement. And Gandhi has had some success in unifying the Indian people behind his message and his strategy and his philosophy, if you will, to the point where he has become known as the Great Soul, or Mahatma. Mahatma Gandhi. A term of great reverence or veneration, reserved for only a very, very few. Questions to this point? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, it would take World War II to really change the game. But prior to the outbreak of World War II, there is a fracturing of the movement. Very brief was the period of time where Gandhi had succeeded in truly unifying the movement for Indian independence, if he ever really, truly did. But it's certainly clear by the 1930s that it would again be organizationally fractured. You had a split between people who were truly Gandhiites, if you will, followers of Gandhi and his philosophy, who were more traditionalists. You know, everything that Gandhi is speaking to would be almost like a revival of the old ways, and the rejection of British rule as something new that had ruined what had been before. So some would criticize it as sort of backward looking. And it is overtly Hindu, too. So it would be for another individual to come forth and have a more forward-looking modernist outlook that embraced industrialization and envisioned a modernized India where you had industrialization for the actual benefit of Indians and not just for the British. India could become an industrial nation state and take its place among the other industrial nation states of the world. So in other words, for someone to come along and say, we can have Indian independence without like stepping back in time, if you will. And two, we can have a secular, a-religious movement. It doesn't have to necessarily be overtly Hindu. The individual leading this charge is Jawaharlal Nehru, pictured here. Nehru is the modernist, secular leader, the more forward-looking, who would, criticize, but you can see they're buddies. Criticize Gandhi's movement as backward-looking. And then two, you have the organization of a new sort of successor to the old Muslim League, an overtly Muslim Indian independence movement under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And when you have violence that begins to break out between Muslims and Hindus struggling for leadership and taking the mantle of Indian nationalism, Jinnah begins calling for a separate Muslim Indian state. He said, if India is going to be independent, we want a separate Muslim nation for the people of South Asia. So vast are our differences and disagreements with the leadership of the Hindus, be it Gandhi or Nehru. Here's Jinnah with Gandhi. Gandhi, by the way, undertakes a fast, stops eating as a way of protesting. Another example of passive resistance. In calling for an end to the violence. and calling for instead cooperation between Hindus and Muslims. But that split would not be reconciled. After World War II, as some imperialist nations embraced decolonization, among them Britain, not all of them did, but Britain does, particularly under the leadership of the Labour Party, the left-leaning party in Britain. The British government finally accedes to independence for the Indian peoples, but along religious lines as Jinnah had called for. So when Indian independence comes, the nation-state of India is created, but also too Pakistan. Pakistan is the Muslim Indian nation-state, which included initially over here what was called East Pakistan, which is today the separate nation-state of Bangladesh. Pakistan, Bangladesh are Muslim Indian nations. India was created to be the Hindu nation. The problem is, not all Muslims in South Asia live in Pakistan or Bangladesh. And conversely, not all Hindus live in what was to be India. And so there are migrations of those peoples, and there are clashes, there's increased violence as a result. And there is great bitterness that lasts to this very day. India and Pakistan are not friends. They are, in fact, great enemies. There is also, then and now, there are also border disputes. Initially, when independence comes in 48, there's a dispute over Hyderabad in the interior, in the southern central part of India. That's ultimately resolved in favor of India. Still unresolved to this very day is the dispute over Kashmir here. India and Pakistan both claim the mountainous Kashmir region up there. That is one of the more heavily armed regions on earth today. Heavily fortified borders. And if you'll remind me, if we have time, at the end, after we've done South Africa, I'll click on those links and show you the, I say this not with irreverence, but the absurdly elaborate ceremonies that they have at the border gates, where they have guards that are like showing off to one another and like almost like bowing up. And then you have grandstands with like hundreds of people that are watching it and cheering it on like rah rah. But it's not all fun and games because both India and Pakistan have nukes. Right? So we really don't want these two to go to an all-out war with one another because that could become a nuclear war. And nobody wants that. And so one of the major efforts of the influential nations of the world, which America, used to be, before we completely acceded to a dereliction of our duty, nations like that would really keep a keen eye on India-Pakistan relations to try to make sure that these tensions don't boil over, because they're always simmering. Questions about anything here? Oh, Gandhi was assassinated, ironically, by a Hindu extremist. And so he only glimpses, sort of realization of the dream of independence. And therefore, the mantle of the leadership of the nation-state of India falls to Nehru, becomes first prime minister. I mean, it would have sort of plainly, obviously been Gandhi had he not been killed. And of course, the first leader of Pakistan is Jinnah. Let's shift gears. And look at South Africa. South Africa was originally colonized by the Dutch in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Prior to the arrival of the Dutch in the 1600s, South Africa was a multi-ethnic region You had people who had over time migrated from farther north as part of the Bantu migrations. You had the Zulu nation there, which was a powerful nation that had militarily vanquished all around it. You had the Xhosa people. You had the Khoisan and the Ndebele, and many others. So it's, again, a multi-ethnic area of Africa that outside of the Zulu was not necessarily unified under any one singular rule. And this is one of the ways that the Dutch are able to establish imperial or colonial control, that and the fact that they have machine guns and things like that eventually. Or rifles early on, I suppose, and later with the British, the tools of industrialized warfare. Over time, though, what happens by the time the British put their footprint on South Africa and begin to establish their control and push the Dutch further north, those Dutch settlers who had lived there by that point for several generations had come to see themselves as African. I mean, they're white supremacists even, but they come to see themselves as not just Dutch, but Dutch-descended Africans, known as Afrikaners. The white Dutch Africans, Afrikaners. And even with their own descendant of the Dutch language known as Afrikaans, with two A's and a K there, as you can see. Afrikaans would be their language. Over time, as the British established firmly their control of all of South Africa and eventually even further north in the colony named for Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist, Rhodesia, it's now Zimbabwe. Over time, the Afrikaners become an oppressed majority. The British are the minority white people, and the Afrikaners are shut out of government by the British and treated as sort of second-class white citizens. Of course, they are treated as more privileged than any black African because it's a racist system, but they are not treated as equal subjects to the British, who are the minority rulers. So these are the dynamics when South Africa, post-World War II, is given by the British government a dominion status, almost like a pseudo-independence where you have home rule, similar to what you saw with the Government of India Act. And then eventually, not long after that, given the status of full independence as a South African republic. These are the dynamics when those things are happening. The most important moment, though, same year that India and Pakistan are given their independence, 1948, the Afrikaners come to power for the first time in South Africa through the Nationalist Party. 1948, the Afrikaners come to power through the Nationalist Party, and they bring with them to that point of rulership a profound uneasiness of, what's the word? I'm going to get pilloried if LG watches this, and that's fine. Anxiety. There's a word out there that I'm grasping for. And if I hadn't spent an hour and 45 minutes in traffic today, it might be easier to grab a hold of it.
It's still in traffic right now.
Huh?
It's still in traffic, the word.
Exactly. They institute that rigid form of segregation that I was talking about to ensure that black Africans, regardless of their ethnicity, apartheid, yeah, are always reminded of their inferior status. The British didn't have such a system, but they did have elements of it that predated Afrikaner rule. They had, for example, a pass system. Black Africans had to at all times have a pass that indicated they were allowed to be wherever it was that they were, which was supposed to be either where they live or where they work, in other words. And it had all your identification information in it and what have you. It was a pass book. And also they had barred black Africans from any participation in government. So black Africans were already, third-class citizens at best under British rule. The Afrikaners bring to this next level system of apartheid. Insecurity. That's the word. Man, I had to grasp for that for a full 5 minutes. Insecurity?
Really?
Yeah.
I was thinking
Insecurity.
Like a complex word.
Yeah, well, they're insecure. They'd spent, how many generations as second-class citizens of the British. They finally get power. And what do they want to do? Make sure that they set themselves up as better, more privileged than the mass of Africans who are black. And this is among the first things they do to institute this system of apartheid. Apartheid is akin to segregation in America, but I don't hesitate to say dramatically and systematically worse. There are, in fact, two forms of apartheid. There's grand apartheid and there's petty apartheid. So, grand apartheid is more similar to what America does to Native Americans. By systematically, through military force, forcing Indians off of their land and onto reservations so that they can exploit Indian land for gold and other mineral resources. Similarly, the Afrikaner nationalist government forces African peoples broken up by their various ethnicities into what they call the Bantustans, the territories, reservations in effect. Inevitably, the shittiest land, not suitable for cultivation, and a fraction of what, acreage-wise, these people had been living on before they were forced into these Bantustans. And typically this leaves these people, the mass of them, with little choice but to work for mining companies and to obtain passes to travel from their Bantustans to the mines to work and be exploited and so on. And here's a map showing you the various Bantustans. Now, in addition to that, in the city, that's in the rural areas, right, out in the countryside. In cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town and Pretoria, black people are forced to live in ghettos known as the townships, like this one here. I think this is Alexandria in Johannesburg. Large portions of which are little more than corrugated metal or wooden shacks, with people living in desperate poverty. And crime and violence that goes along with desperate poverty. And oppression from white police forces that would police these townships. Some of the people that live in these townships do obtain work in other parts of the city, but of course you have to have a pass book that allows you to be out beyond the township, showing that you do indeed have gainful employment somewhere else. And you can be shaken down at any time, violently, by the white police forces, who are generally comprised of angry, lower-class Afrikaner people who like to beat up on folks for no good reason. And then when you were out and about beyond the townships, there's petty apartheid, which is similar to America's Jim Crow. Segregation of all public accommodations. Restaurants, hotels, parks, beaches, as you see pictured here. Got the sign in Afrikaans and in English telling you this beach is for white people only. And look at this. This is a totally a late 20th century American thing too. To use, like, to go out of your way to not say, like, you know, black people, white people, blacks can't do this, etc. Non-European hospital and European hospital, meaning British and Afrikaner people, i.e. white people, can use this hospital and everybody else gets to use the other one. Play park for European children only. You got it in Afrikaans below that. Oh, and in the Afrikaans, it does just say outright, just for white kids. So in the English, they use the code language. In the Afrikaans, they don't even care. That's for white kids. Member of the police forces that would terrorize the townships, shotgun and a German Shepherd. Scenes of a mass police beating at top left. Well, needless to say, black Africans organize in opposition to such oppression. In fact, organization for black South Africans predated Afrikaner rule, and black nationalists had formed an African National Congress inspired by the Indian National Congress, indeed, in 1912. Protest against things like the passbook system and their complete lack of participation in governance and politics. It's very similar to the early INC, and that these are well-educated, Western-oriented, elite black South Africans who are simply arguing for limited reforms and for people like them to be able to participate in politics and governing. So the same thing with the early movement in India. They're not calling for outright independence. They're not representing the needs and concerns of all black Africans. But after World War II, they began to radicalize. And in 1955, the ANC joins with several other groups and adopts a freedom charter announcing a much more expansive program. So the African National Congress joins with the South African Communist Party and the South African Indian National Congress. Remember, there's a lot of Indian workers in South Africa. They organize. And they issue this, or adopt this freedom charter that calls for equality for everyone in South Africa, for a land redistribution program that would give land to the landless, for better wages and conditions for workers, especially in the mines, and for free education for all. So this is a relatively radical document, which the South African government, the Afrikaner government, dismisses as just a radical communist nonsense. And in doing so, really establishes firmly its anti-communist credentials, which when we talk about the Cold War, would make the Afrikaner government a strong ally of the United States, the dominant power in the capitalist world at the time. And we'll talk about how America aligns itself with numerous governments that are incredibly oppressive and with no respect for human rights, simply because they're capitalists and not communists. Such was American diplomacy in the Cold War. And there would be no reckoning until the 1980s, as we'll see. The Afrikaner government also throws the leaders of ANC in jail for being a threat to the government in issuing this or adopting this freedom charter. The leaders of ANC who are imprisoned at that time would include Nelson Mandela, picture bottom center. He is later released. And by the time he is released, he is even more radicalized. Especially after 1960, when in Sharpeville, several thousand blacks had gathered to protest the pass laws in one of the townships. And a non-violent, unarmed crowd marched to a police station. And a form of passive resistance, of civil disobedience, by deliberately marching there without their passbooks and demanding to be jailed en masse. But mind you, there are thousands of them. There's no way they could have been jailed, and this was the point. So an act of mass civil disobedience that eventually prompts frightened police inside the police station to just start firing indiscriminately into the crowd, killing 69 people, including women and children, some of whom were shot in the back as they were attempting to flee the gunfire. 69 killed, 180 wounded. The dead littering the ground, as you see in that horrifying photograph. This is the moment at which Mandela and some others in ANC decide to leave nonviolence behind, if you will. The time for nonviolence, they would say, has passed. And they are so enraged by the Sharpeville massacre that they resolved to form Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation. Umkhonto we Sizwe would be the armed wing of the African National Congress, which would engage in a decades-long campaign of guerrilla warfare against the nationalist government, carrying out bombings, assassinations, etc., defending black South Africans from the violence of the police forces and so on. In 1963, Mandela and some of the ANC's leadership are arrested and in the Rivonia trials sentenced to life in prison for the activities of Umkhonto we Sizwe. Mandela and others are sent to prison for life. The movement, of course, carries on. In fact, Mandela's very imprisonment would become a cause célèbre eventually over time. Question? You know, we're talking about the 1960s at a time when the, what I call classical phase of the civil rights movement in America is in full swing. That 1963, that same year, the 16th Street Church is bombed in Birmingham, and the following year, the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act after the events at Selma and so on. And so there is a something of a reckoning with racial oppression in America. It does not happen in South Africa. Apartheid remains stronger than ever, even into the 1980s. Into the late 1980s. That system of apartheid is still in place, and the nationalists are still in power. And if anything, apartheid had gotten worse as the government clamps down, particularly after it issues a state of emergency. A massive crackdown on even nonviolent protests by the ANC or anybody else. The ANC had by that time started to try to raise awareness beyond South Africa's borders to try to get international support for this freedom movement. I mentioned Mandela's imprisonment. It garners widespread international attention. Some in the American Civil Rights Movement and even in the U.S. Congress start working to raise awareness of the situation in South Africa, to get America to question its allegiance to this government that was a gross violator of human rights. South Africa is increasingly marginalized internationally. Its sports teams, which are all white, were banned from various international competitions. Other countries would refuse to play, like, for example, the South African rugby team. as a form of protest of what the South African government was doing. Companies, corporations start to disinvest or divest themselves from any involvement in business in South Africa. Companies like General Electric and Kodak pull out of South Africa. Kodak, it was noted, called out that Kodak was supplying the film on which the photos for the passbooks were used. So people are like, you're complicit in the system, and of course Kodak doesn't want to lose business, so they're like, all right, we're out. Banks stopped doing business with South African corporations. Universities across the world that had any connection whatsoever to South Africa divest themselves. And then finally, in 1986, the U.S. Congress, over the veto of Ronald Reagan, the president, passes a comprehensive anti-apartheid act, which banned any new investment by American corporations in South Africa. It banned any loans from American banks to companies in South Africa or the South African government. It banned the importation of South African agricultural products, steel, textiles, uranium, etc. Economic sanctions, in other words, are placed upon South Africa by the United States and other nations. Ultimately, it is probably these economic sanctions which did the most to undermine the nationalist government and to turn the tide against the government's policy of apartheid and banning black South Africans from having any role whatsoever in governance. In 1990, this is probably beyond what we were just looking at. There's any singular moment in which you see a turning of the tide. It's probably the rise to power of F.W. de Klerk, who you see there standing talking with Mandela. De Klerk is a moderate. So finally, after years of hard-line, obdurate, immovable nationalist rule, you finally get somebody in there that's a moderate. We'll see something similar when we look at the Soviet Union and talk about Mikhail Gorbachev. De Klerk pretty quickly proves that he is willing to negotiate at least with ANC, to recognize what this tremendous international ostracization has done and the harm that has been done by these economic sanctions, and shows a willingness to have some kind of movement. He actually releases Mandela from prison after 26 years. Mandela spent in that prison cell on Robben Island off the coast of Cape Town. And de Klerk begins working with Mandela on plans to actually hold free elections. For 3 years, these two negotiate and form indeed a transitional government to oversee this process of holding in 1994 for the very first time elections in which black South Africans could vote. Think about it. Part of the resistance on the part of the Afrikaners is that they are a minority. I mean, yes, there were more of them than the English when they were held second class to the English, but black South Africans dramatically outnumber white people there. And if free and fair elections were ever held, ANC is going to win that running away. And that's what happens. And Nelson Mandela becomes president. A new constitution is adopted in 1996. And so not only do you have an end to apartheid, but you have an upending of South African society. Mandela, though, and you think about this, really, really remarkable. A man who had initially embraced nonviolent resistance, but who is driven to violent resistance after Sharpeville, who is imprisoned and spends 26 years in a prison cell, along with others, he had some time to stew about shit, you know what I mean? And he and others, when they finally came to power, could have turned this around, oppressed, white Afrikaners and people who'd had anything to do with apartheid and the former police forces that had brutalized and murdered people. They could have thrown the former leaders in jail and so on, but Mandela instead embraces and pushes the idea that what they needed was peace, unification, truth, and reconciliation. He works with the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Anglican Archbishop, on a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which would allow people either who had fought with Umkhonto Wesizwe, who had been a part of Afrikaner nationalist police forces, who had engaged in any kind of acts of violence, to come forward, admit what they had done, and to be reconciled, instead of being jailed or being subject to reprisals. Come forth and confess what you have done, and we'll forgive one another, and we can move forward. There are a couple of symbolic ways in which Mandela pushes this imperative too. One, look at the South African flag. Black, white, yellow, green, we all move forward together. And of course, red, white, and blue had long symbolized liberal democratic freedom in governments of the Western world. But two, they adopt as the new national anthem for South Africa, Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika, God Save Africa. And it is sung officially in Xhosa, in Zulu, in English, and in Afrikaans. There's verse after verse after verse in those different languages. A way of symbolically showing that we can all move forward together as South Africans. Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika. And so this is a remarkable moment in world history in the 1990s, and perhaps most remarkable of all, Mandela could have been president of South Africa for the rest of his life. But I guess not dissimilar to George Washington in America, decides I don't want to be set up as some sort of pseudo-monarch, and I'm going to voluntarily step aside, which he does in 1999, succeeded by his close associate Thabo Mbeki. And then by Jacob Zuma. I need to update this PowerPoint. When I made it, Zuma was still president and began facing all kinds of... South Africa's had a lot of problems. Just because the ANC comes to power doesn't mean you can erase the effects of 100 years of oppression or more. And so it's still, especially in the cities and out in the countryside in some areas, there's profound poverty. Those former townships are still sites of profound poverty and violence and hunger. And under Zuma, there's some issues of corruption, which sees him set aside in favor of the new president, Ramaphosa. And so it's not that South Africa is magically without problems. That being said, South Africa is the wealthiest nation in Africa, the most industrialized nation in Africa, and probably easily the best hope for an African multiracial state. And now I've gone over. Questions? Anything at all?
What was F.W. de Klerk's position of power exactly?
So he's a president, and a moderate, and the one who agrees to share power. It's another remarkable moment. De Klerk, against the insistence of the hardliners in his own party, Nationalist Party, agrees to work with Mandela, knowing that the movement, you were on the verge of a revolution at that point, and you'd been completely isolated from the rest of the world, and it's a sort of last gasp. But it would have to be somebody who was a moderate, because the position of the hardliners, as you got closer and closer to outright crisis of revolution in the streets, was just clamp down, harder. Everybody else be damned. De Klerk steps in and does a complete reversal and says, no, let's actually stave this off. by actually reaching out the hand and working with Mandela on some kind of transitional government. And I forget, I think he retains the title of president, and Mandela has some sort of provisional, like, vice presidential title. And then when they hold the elections and ANC wins control of parliament, then Mandela becomes president. He might have been prime minister. I can never, the nations, some of them have both. It doesn't matter. He's the leader of the nationalist government and therefore South Africa when this about face occurs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What else? All right. Well, that's that.